Shin Sekai Yori, translated as From the New World, is one of the most unique anime out there. The show is adapted not from a manga or visual novel, but an actual literary novel, which won a science fiction award in its native Japan, the 29th Nihon Sci-fi Taisho Award. From what I hear, having read only a bit of the novel on which the show is based, it follows its source material fairly closely. Given this background, it shouldn't be surprising that Shin Sekai Yori stands out as an anime. In its densely plotted narrative, its reams of foreshadowing, its slow pace and gradual build-up, and in its almost complete lack of fan service that normally besots the medium. Shin Sekai Yori is a legitimate epic, sweeping in its scope on the level of both time and of space. The narrative delves deep into topics ranging from how to contain violence to the conflict between individuals and society, from the indoctrination of youth to the nature of personhood. Throughout, the show maintains a kind of organic commitment to the reality of its world, one that is fantastically imagined, never sacrificing that reality for any sort of audience appeal. This is something I find rare and commendable, especially in this medium, and so I want to attempt to describe what the show does so well in my eyes, what it is about, and hopefully contribute something to its legacy. The visuals are not Shin Sekai Yori's strong suit. The show was made around the same time A1 Pictures was working on Sword Art Online, and it's not hard to guess which show the animation budget primarily went to. There are uncommon moments of sketchy animation, and overall the animation detail is low, but the show is always interesting to look at. This is in part largely thanks to its gorgeous art direction, for example in the creative and varied clothing. I would argue varied clothing is a better choice than an iconic outfit for this type of show, which is going for a realistic science fiction world, not eye-catching, larger-than-life archetypal characters. The organic, fascinating creatures and scenic backgrounds that encompass all four seasons throughout the show's narrative also contribute to this. The background art can also be quite impressive at times, as shown above. Episodes 5 and 10 are rather infamous for the shift in art style brought on by an apparently infamous guest director, but I find they both, particularly episode 10, actually fit well with the section of the story and setting in those episodes. There are also a few times in the early episodes during flashbacks and tales that utilize a highly stylized art direction distinct from each one, and the rest of the show that gives these moments an often eerie storybook feel, vaguely akin to the book sequences in Monster. The art manages to immerse the viewer in a wide variety of settings, from the almost oppressive, not quite right, dimly lit gray school interiors early on, to the mesmerizing ethereal auroras and bizarre Mentos shapes in the lake bed during episode 10, from the bittersweet, innocent twilight hours of childhood before the group of friends return home through late summer fields in the first episodes, to the wild and dangerous and even grotesque visuals as in the primal forests of the Queer Rats, and especially the bowels of the destroyed Tokyo, or the pristine and chilling forest landscapes during the winter arc searching for lost friends in the snows. The world of Shin Sekai Yori encompasses all four seasons, and an even wider range of deeply conveyed moods, as manifest through its beautifully rural, dystopian vision of the Japanese countryside 1,000 years into the future. The foreboding atmosphere throughout the series is thick enough that one can imagine cutting it like butter. It's up there with the giants of atmosphere: Blade Runner, Angel's Egg, Mushishi, Annihilation, Ghost in the Shell, etc. This is achieved in no small part via its incredible soundtrack, which specializes in the creation of dread. 3 songs dominate the show: traditional Song of Shadows, Wareta Ringo, and From the New World. The first has 3 versions, all of which to some degree convey a kind of haunting, mystical, and significant event coming to pass, in both the present and future tenses. Thanks to deep drums accompanied by the haunting vocals of a child choir, it expresses awe in the sense that includes the horror of the numinous, of that beyond human ken. Wareta Ringo is a gorgeous piece full of stutter-step guitar strings and rich female vocals that serves as the first ending theme. The show has no OP, other than a pseudo one in episode 16, which begins with a flashback sequence. The theme conveys the bittersweet and melancholic yearning for something just out of reach, against the impressive, complex weight of the world, most peculiar to life and adolescence. From the New World, taken from Dvorak's Ninth Symphony of the same name, makes 4 critical contributions to the show. conveying the nostalgic halcyon vibe early on, the world building aspect, in which the piece serves as the curfew cue for the children to return home, played through loudspeakers across the village, the connection to Dvorak's symphony in our world, of course, lending the novel adaptation another connection to high culture, and the haunting, eerie, tragic, and melancholic final cue as the village leader, Tomiko's second in command, dies while sending out the message as a warning and distraction during the war. The theme cut short as he is presumably cut down. The world building is where the greatest power of Shin Sekai Yori lies. This is one of the all-time great worlds in anime, not for the scope, like Legend of the Galactic Heroes, nor the visuals, Miyazaki and Makoto Shinkai films, and certainly not for the desire to be transported to that world, like in Pokemon, let's be honest, given the chilling dangers around so many corners, but rather for the interconnections within itself, for how everything fits together organically, and how the seeds for what is to come can be seen within the first arc all over the place, if the viewer pays careful attention. This is a show that heavily rewards rewatching. Any apparent plot holes either have an explanation if one looks for them, or are a matter of degree and inspired debate about what the full explanation for why the world and the society were shown ended up a particular way. Ideally, one gets into a calm, meditative state beforehand to best appreciate the nearly peerless atmosphere and world building this show offers. It takes a depth of openness and imagination to essence lock the characters and what it would be like in that world, but when you do make that effort, in many ways it's simply a curiosity and a lack of compulsion for showy stimulation, the world of Shin Sekai Yori reveals itself, gradually and mysteriously, to be as complex and deep and raw as the best ever captured in the medium. This connection does not primarily reside in the animation or artwork, but in the gradual unfolding of the world and all its interconnectivities. This is without even mentioning the brilliantly creative sci-fi ideas at play, particularly how the imagined psychotechnologies would realistically result in the society we are shown. The characters are given just enough flesh to make them real, without distracting from the world and themes that the show most excels at. Saki, the sensitive yet curious and courageous late bloomer who wants to know the truth above all. Satoru, the cocky boy who matures into responsibility as the gravity of their world becomes apparent. Maria, the chick at first glance, the popular, precious girl who is nonetheless seated in the viewer's mind early on as someone who, had she never been born, many people could have been spared, and thus casting a shadowy Chekhov's gun over the course of the narrative, especially shocking considering how innocent she seems. Mamoru, the gentle boy who invokes both pity and fear, both for him and for what his weakness might cause in a moment of crisis. And Shun, the calm, capable, kind, and curious prodigy of the class, whose relatively early erasure casts a twin shadow of wonder and yearning over the show via Saki, and to a lesser extent Satoru, to accompany the shadow of dread and regret cast by Maria. The relationships the characters build are all the more convincingly strong simply because of the visceral danger they encounter, because of the sense of danger and dread, of the very understandable fear of death that the show's atmosphere and world building convey so powerfully to the audience. The viewer is able to bond with the characters and grasp the strengths of their bonds among each other simply via the shared experiences that deepen bonds when humans undergo danger and loss together. Similarly, the romantic bonds can be understood both in terms of the fascinating world-building aspect that incorporates bonobo hypersexual behavior as a palliative for teenage angst-driven violence that would be catastrophic in the society of the show, but also simply for emphasizing the age, via the first time skip, of the main characters being in the flowering grip of adolescent hormonal urges. Thus, in both cases, the plot and world building support the relationships of the characters in a way that to some degree counteracts the lack of traditional characterization and relationship building, which the show largely avoids dealing in. The cast outside the main five is always functional at worst. At best, there is Squealer, one of the most complex villains in anime history. Rising from a groveling, sycophantic member of one of the weaker Quirat tribes, abused by his queen, and yet slightly unnerving at times with the glimmer of a schemer in his eyes, to a mastermind general that forcibly unites the tribes, kidnaps and brainwashes a human child to be his god-killing ace, Messiah, and leads a brutal war against humankind on behalf of his subaltern, genuinely oppressed species. He has shades of both Napoleon Bonaparte and Vladimir Lenin. His democratic but vicious revolution against the ancient monarchy of the Quirat queens, clearly paralleling both the French and Bolshevik revolutions. Kiromaru is his counterpart, a kind of noble savage figure representing the loyal nobility of a retainer to his lords, and yet clearly fiercely intelligent, understanding the motivation behind Squealer's war, himself having once sought power for the day of opportune revolution. There is a reason Squealer lit a fire of passionate discussion in the anime community. His ideals draw energy from the same well as modern social justice ideology. In both cases, equality is close to the core value, and the sympathy toward those under such oppression is understandable. And yet such admirable intentions as freedom and equality of opportunity can also slide into retributive justice and a resentment-fueled desire to invert the system and take vengeance, instead of achieving peace and individual freedom. The village leader Tomiko is also a very pleasant surprise, a nuanced portrait of someone who has seen horrific suffering and thus has made the morally questionable, if understandable, decision to attempt to ensure such events are not repeated, even at the cost of wasted life. She is a mature, realistic character and leader, and also gets bonus points for being a female anime character over 200 years old and not looking like a child. Saki's strength is being able to look at reality, having the desire to understand reality, rather than retreat into the fantasies society offers. Saki is often described as strong by other characters. As Iris Murdoch wrote, human beings cannot bear too much reality. Saki bears the reality of her world when everyone else around her wants to retreat into comforting lies or ideology. This is why Tomiko sees her successor in Saki. I think extroverts and those enculturated to expect extroverted protagonists fail to understand her strength because it derives from yin energy, from being resilient rather than active, and also from her desire for a better world in the face of authoritarian stricture that fails to bury this steadfast desire. And she does break many rules in her search for truth and in her moral integrity, saving both Skunk and Squealer in her childhood, going after Shun, continuing her search for what happens in the village despite both adults and even her friends asking otherwise, asking for Kiromaru's help, wanting to try saving the fiend by allowing it to recognize itself in spite of the agreed upon plan, and then most of all in destroying the Psychobuster, on some level wanting to understand what the child is and not kill it, at least not in that way, and primarily due to her selfish but understandable desire to save Satoru, perhaps the one person she trusts, and the only one aside from herself who survived the formative childhood traumas of their group. Shun reminds me of Sasuke a bit, both in their role as a calm ace early on, their descent to the dark side, and even their clothing style after a time skip, white badass robes with long black hair. Perhaps due to his intelligence and curiosity, Shun realized the purpose of the barrier, a hypnotic suggestion that monsters and the other lie outside it, so that any internal shadows are projected beyond. It functions in part like a religion that treats internal demons, manifested here as unstable PK power, as external forces that one can be possessed by, and so the psychic power of the villagers is literally projected beyond the barrier and creates monstrosities far away. After this, he could no longer delude himself into leaking only beyond it. As he said, all problems begin in the mind. Shun underwent what I call the faith function paradox, no longer able to project his shadows out into the faraway world, having recognized their reality as within. More specifically, after he realized the function of the barrier, it no longer functioned for him. Faith requires an element of mystery. This complex can apply to nearly everything, and leads toward nihilism. Shun's beads that he constantly levitates give his mind something to do, a task to distract the dark of his subconscious from rising to the surface. This is his method of controlling his shadow temporarily, akin to daily rituals one might do to stabilize negative thoughts through meditation, gratitude journaling, etc. The only reliable method of ridding oneself of their shadow, however, is paradoxically to integrate it into oneself so that it is no longer an other. In the end, Shun was consumed by his own shadow, representing the danger of understanding too much too early in life when one is all too intelligent, both because it renders one more susceptible to understanding things one is not altogether ready to face, and because it allows one to project the potential consequences of this knowledge even further afterward. The plot is massive in the scope of time it covers. On a world-building level, it encompasses 1,000 years, while on the level of the main characters we journey alongside, 14 years of their life pass. centered on 3 different seasons in time, when they are 12, 14, and finally 26 years old, each featuring about 8 episodes. All the seasons are represented as well, lending another adornment that puts the world into a real sense of time and place. As Babda of Wrong Every Time aptly put it, the narrative builds toward a finale that seems inevitable, which is always a good sign. There is indeed an almost uncanny sense of fate pulsing through the show, growing over time, seemingly pulling the characters and their world towards something terrible, in the old full sense of the word. There is an odd sense of biological necessity behind much of what occurs. The show somehow reminds me of Mushishi in some ways, the rural Japanese countryside and the strange and dangerous forces and creatures existing in the forests outside the pockets of civilized villages. The carefully doled out bits of info gradually reveal an incredibly cohesive world, at a rate always leaving the viewer hungry for more, if they are paying full attention. Essentially every episode ends on a cliffhanger that feels almost always organic and inevitable in some sense, rather than manipulative, while still being impactful because of the time taken to build up the world, and thus the consequence of these events is readily grasped. Of course the weak girl would be cold. Of course the rule breaker would be cold. Of course Saki would eventually encounter a trickster cat. Of course they would eventually face the village leader. Of course the insecure Mamoru would be the weak link in the group who runs away, etc. On first impression, the central twist, reveal, tragedy of the show, that the supposed fiend responsible for so much death and destruction in the final arc is the child of Maria and Mamoru, raised by Squealer to believe it's a queerat, seems delivered anticlimactically when Satoru simply states his opinion of it. But what makes this reveal brilliant is that the audience is given the opportunity for awe, having placed seeds of foreshadowing through the show, beginning with the cliffhanger in episode 2 on how Maria not having been born would have spared so many lives, then Saki's disturbing dream with the figure telling her Maria has to die, then the reveal that Maria and Mamoru's bones were inspected and confirmed as authentic at the DNA level, then the entire hospital episode revealing the presence of a fiend, all leading up to the point where the fiend is walking down the village street through a mirage of heat, wearing a tattered shawl, and then revealing a strand of long pink hair similar to Maria's dangling from the hood. As soon as the face is shown and the fiend exposed as a clear child, that awful revelation is thus conveyed completely without dialogue, all the better to hit with the visceral, imagistic force of 12 years and more of tragic wonder at how things led to this abomination of a situation. If the audience is paying proper attention. If not, Satoru's reveal still comes off as quite bluntly realistic, and in this time of desperation the statement is delivered in a frank manner that belies all the tragedy that led to it, and makes sense coming from the always pragmatic Satoru. The show expects the audience to do the work to get the initial reveal. It does not hold their hand here. One of my favorite, relatively subtle aspects of the show is how organically and fluidly it moves through various genres, without ever feeling forced or obvious. The show's genre shifts from mystery, to school competition, to outdoor slice of life, to sci-fi thriller, to fantasy adventure, to teenage drama, back to ominous mystery, to horror, to military drama, to sci-fi epic, to tragic social commentary. It is all of these things, embracing the rich complexity of existence, devoid of bullshit attempts at forced humor, romance, power fantasy, or exaggeration of any kind. The final arc is so good in part because it delves deep into the past and exposes several revelations both large and personal. The state of Tokyo, Kiramaru's purposes during his expeditions there, Saki's returned memory of Shun, the Messiah's true nature, and the origin of the queerats, and finally ends with a battered but hopeful gaze toward the future. After world building, theme is Shin Sekai Yori's strongest aspect. There are major themes of totalitarianism with the Education Committee. The queerats, as mentioned, echo both the French Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution, and a key theme revealed toward the end involves the importance of imagination and the subjectivity of what constitutes personhood, and denying it, toward the queerats from the humans' perspective, toward the humans from the Messiah's perspective, and even toward humans under 17 years of age from the perspective of the Education Committee. Other themes include the power of indoctrination, the danger of youths for toppling order via their chaotic nature, Shun's story on the danger of a mind that is too curious, too powerful for the ideology given it to contain, the unreliability of memory, true even without alterations by a totalitarian committee, and the agape-like forgiveness and willingness to see the personhood and sacredness in other beings not generally given this attribution, that Saki displays both early on toward Skunk, then Squealer and his queen to a degree, and eventually also to Maria and Mamoru's child, which had wreaked so much destruction, when she attempts to show it its true nature. Saki is the only one who attempts to see the personhood in all three parties, the humans, queerats, and the supposed fiend. Saki can be read as having to face up to her complicity in institutional violence, specifically toward queerats, as her job directly involves them. In spite of most of the violence being intertribal warfare, it still is brought on by continued lack of regard for them as sapient and worthwhile agents. Her compassion for them is notable in her youth, but after the second time skip she has grown jaded, watching them die, though still is somewhat curious, and actively resents and turns on them after the attack on the village, asking what have humans ever done that was so bad to them. This, to me, speaks of the theme of losing the truth of the sacredness of life known intuitively in youth, and becoming desensitized through repeated exposure in adulthood. She is only starting to come out of her callousness, the revelation that they used to be human being a key cracking point, at the end, when giving Squealer a merciful death. Perhaps the most dominant theme explored of the show's length is how to control power and curb violence in society. This is complicated by the fact that such power inheres in children as well, before they've been successfully indoctrinated by the older generation's conceptions of society, and that this power is nearly at the level of nuclear weaponry. Such a thematic exploration is particularly timely in our own era, given the increased public availability of weapons of mass autonomous violence on the horizon, particularly weaponized drones. Cantus PK, the magic system in Shin Sekai Yori, is predictive of this near-future democratization of violence, as in the form of such commercial weaponized drones, or the ability to easily make bioweapons. There seems to be a trend that offense always outstrips defense in the temporal sense, as in the case of Cantus, as it is in our own world. The show's society of love, attack inhibition, and death feedback could be posited as perhaps viable near-future solutions, with some of their dangers fully represented, to the potential violence a single individual will be able to wreak, thanks to the growing plausibility of biofeedback and gene editing technology. Another theme is, of course, the internal corruption of regimes that choose to kill, especially when their targets may well be innocent, and the methods used to distance oneself from the blood on one's hands. The Education Committee sends the impure cats to kill potentially problematic children in order to avoid the death feedback that would trigger their own death, had they committed the murder directly. This is akin to military commanders or politicians, especially in modern times, issuing orders from a safe room, far from battle, to have someone killed they've never once interacted with, whether this be raids in Vietnam or drone warfare today in the Middle East. Some additional scattered thoughts about the show before concluding. The pacing is top-notch, reflecting reality. It does not pander. It has a story to relate and a world to show, and it doesn't break it up into manipulative chunks out of an attempt to keep audience attention. It respects, and at times demands, intelligence and patience in the viewer. The show does subtlety better than just about any other anime I've seen. It's painted in gorgeous shades of gray, like a proper novel, both the slightly dark visuals throughout and the moral complexity and unpredictable pacing. Shin Sekai Yori understands the power of silence, unlike so much art, but akin to Miyazaki and Mushishi, among other masterworks. It grasps the energy of yin. It knows when not to show things, when to be silent. For example, Saki only hearing of Mamoru and Maria's apparent death offhand, when Tomiko coolly describes how the bones claimed to be theirs were fully inspected and deemed authentic down to the teeth imprints. It lets the audience's imagination gradually fill in more and more haunting details about their possible fate, drawing evidence from the show's past, as more is indirectly hinted at later on. This void, the tragic fate of Maria and Mamoru, is close to the core of the show in my view, and yet, yin-like, it is unknown, the black gravitational force that so many key events in the last half of the show originate from. Tokyo is only the nightmarish landscape it is because humans believe it to be so, and thus their Cantus leakage is directed particularly toward Tokyo outside the barrier, mutating creatures in the environment there. Themes of how one creates their own monsters, self-fulfilling prophecy, the power of the shadow to manifest when repressed, subconscious existence. All problems begin in the mind. This quote is densely packed with meaning, both in and outside the show itself. Within, it points to the antisocial desires that caused so much destruction, thanks to the mental power of Cantus. and perhaps most profoundly the mental origin of categories, most prominently what constitutes personhood. Shun appeared to Saki in Tokyo perhaps because the Cantus leakage there was strong enough to break through the barrier in her mind, either Saki or Shun or both contributing to the removal of the false block on her memory. Themes of insight at the lowest point, in a vista onto heaven, the view with Shun within hell, Tokyo. Also, major mythological themes of encountering the dead in the underworld, Shun appearing to Saki, akin to Orpheus, Theseus, Odysseus, Aeneas, Dante, etc., and hell is also fitting as the final climax of the story arc, with the undercity of Tokyo being explicitly compared to this. Some themes on Hegel's master and slave dialectic. The queerats know all the humans' weaknesses, their distraction during the festival, their vulnerability to indoctrination and location of their children, ambush tactics being effective against PK, using the canals with the mosquito squid. While the humans underestimate the queerats, the humans have even mentally castrated themselves in a sense, and stopped developing or improving, while the queerats have continued to advance, making guns, bioweapons, democracy, etc. The humans became complacent and arrogant. The death of shame can also be read as a commentary on Japanese culture, relying on social stigma or shame as a prime catalyst, or motivation in this case, for pro-social behavior, and a deterrent for antisocial behavior, to the extent that when someone fails to be indoctrinated, such as a fiend, or has mental health issues, like a karmic demon, they are a threat to society, as the society is so conditioned to be polite they are unable to fight back. Perhaps a commentary on Japan's de-armament after World War II and modern pacifism. This is also supported by the Psychobuster being long locked away, as a nuclear weapon allegory. The Messiah perhaps represents a threat that neither failed to be indoctrinated nor had mental health issues, but rather was taught to think of itself as part of another tribe. Perhaps xenophobia could be read here. Not that the author would be doing this, of course, but from the village, and perhaps a commentary on the insularity of Japanese society, as well as perhaps thinking of non-Japanese as less intelligent and brutish or Philistine, like the queerats. The show is so brilliant in how it conveys the scope of time and the sense of a lived world, and how the first 4 arcs, technically the first 2 seasons are 1 arc in terms of time skips, sync with the passage of the seasons, and in the perfect order for a narrative. Spring being the first 2 episodes at school when one is still innocent, episodes 3 through 7 on a wild summer camp adventure into nature, 8 through 11 being the mystery and tragedy of autumn, 12 through 16 being the forsaken harsh loneliness of winter. The final arc of 8 episodes is largely a war, in which the normal passage of seasons is forgotten in the chaos. Kiramaru and Squealer, or Yakumaru, exemplify conservative and progressive personalities, respectively. Kiramaru's loyalty to old monarchy systems and queen, his honor code and martial nature, versus Squealer's visionary progressivism and deceptive, superficially sycophantic nature. It's brilliant that Saki cries when hearing about the karmic demon girl killing herself in Tomiko's tale, as her subconscious likely recognizes the similarity to her last memory with Shun, after her memories have been erased. Mamoru likely being the one who drew the line art of Saki and Maria that was sent with her letter, given he's shown to be artistically gifted and even drew Maria in the past, is so sentimentally tragic. I wonder if Maria asked him to. Maybe Shun's ability, trained to accelerate life as in the chicken egg, partly led to his powers growing out of control, since he was training in the acceleration of growth in the first place. There are echoes of Joel choosing Ellie over the world in The Last of Us, spoilers, when Saki destroys the Psychobuster to save Satoru at the expense of humanity. I once heard Shin Sekai Yori described as a show out of time, or from a time past. It was and remains an oddity in a landscape of high school and isekai light novel adaptations with vibrant visuals and tailor-made fan service. In 2012, a high-concept sci-fi novel adaptation stood out, but not necessarily to its initial popularity. In time, I expect and hope the show will receive the commendation I believe it deserves, but more importantly, and regardless, it will remain a beacon to an intricately detailed world. Thanks for listening.